In 2012, Canadian authorities received over 22,000 calls about a single problem in one of the most extraordinary public response events in the country's recent history. They weren't reporting a fire. They weren't reporting an earthquake. They were reporting a sound that many of them couldn't even clearly describe. Something low. Something felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. And for years, nobody could definitively prove where it was coming from. Nobody could explain why some people could feel it and others couldn't. Nobody could make it stop. Windsor, Ontario, a city of approximately 200,000 people on the Canadian bank of the Detroit River. On the other side, a few kilometers away, the state of Michigan, an ordinary place. Residential neighborhoods, factories, a port. Nothing that would suggest in 2011 that its residents would start reporting something that sounded, from the outside, like collective anxiety. The first complaints arrived at Ontario's Ministry of the Environment in 2011. Isolated at first. People in West Windsor, South Windsor, LaSalle. They weren't describing conventional noise. They were describing a presence. A persistent, intermittent hum. Very low in frequency. Sometimes more of a vibration than a sound. Walls vibrated. Floors vibrated. Dogs refused to settle. People reported weeks of disrupted sleep, chronic headaches, nausea, a permanent state of irritation they couldn't explain to anyone, because not everyone around them felt anything. And that was perhaps the most quietly devastating part. Not everyone could perceive it. Research into low-frequency sensitivity suggests that somewhere between 2 and 4% of the general population is consistently able to perceive low-frequency emissions of this type. The rest? Silence. Nothing. That asymmetry created real domestic tension. Someone was losing sleep over something their partner, lying in the same bed, simply could not detect. And without a clear, identifiable source, the easiest explanation was, maybe it's in your head. Under public pressure, authorities moved. Ontario's Ministry of the Environment launched formal investigations. Researchers from the University of Windsor and Western University began deploying microphone arrays across the south end of the city. And then the instruments picked up something real. A recurring mechanical signal with a dominant frequency of approximately 35 hertz, oscillating between 30 and 40, consistent, measurable, and physical. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't psychosomatic. It was a real physical object, a sound wave, moving through the atmosphere above Windsor. 35 hertz sits near the lower boundary of human perception. The theoretical floor is 20 hertz. So the signal was audible, but barely. That borderline position explains why some people felt it clearly, and others detected nothing at all. But researchers also noticed something about how the signal behaved once it entered buildings. Low-frequency sound waves carry very large wavelengths, sometimes dozens of meters. That means they pass through water, ground, and solid structures with minimal attenuation. Walls do not stop them. But once inside an enclosed space, something specific happens. Rooms act as resonance chambers. They trap the wave. They amplify it. The walls of an ordinary living room were literally vibrating at 35 hertz. People weren't escaping the noise by going indoors. They were stepping into an amplifier. There was also the question of timing. The phenomenon was consistently reported as more intense and more noticeable at night. The researchers had an explanation for that too. During the day, ambient urban noise, traffic, industrial activity, the mid and high frequencies of a living city masked the 35 hertz signal. It didn't disappear. It was there the entire time. But it was buried. At night, when the city went quiet and background noise dropped to near nothing, the low-frequency wave had no competition. It was left alone in the silence. Once the signal's physical reality was confirmed, researchers began tracing its origin. Microphone arrays at multiple points across South Windsor were used to apply acoustic triangulation. The vectors consistently converged in the same direction, toward the river, toward the American Bank, toward an industrial island in Michigan called Zug Island. Zug Island is not somewhere you stumble onto. It is an artificial island, completely cut off from the mainland, operated by U.S. Steel. Massive blast furnaces, industrial pipelines, infrastructure opaque from the outside, and for investigators inaccessible from across an international border. The Canadian investigators had triangulated a likely source, but it was on American territory on private industrial land beyond Canadian jurisdiction. Attempting to gain direct access ran into genuine legal and diplomatic barriers, private property protections, jurisdictional limits, procedural complications at the federal level. Canadian authorities could not compel access to private industrial facilities on U.S. soil. This wasn't a shadowy conspiracy. It was the mundane architecture of international law, functioning exactly as designed. For years, thousands of people had a credible answer to where the sound was coming from. They could see the island's industrial lights reflected in the river at night from the Canadian Bank, and there was nothing legally available to make it stop. Windsor was not unique, and that detail adds a different dimension to this story. Taos, New Mexico, early 1990s. Roughly 2% of the local community reported a persistent low-frequency noise, described consistently as a diesel engine idling somewhere in the distance. The United States Congress funded an investigation. Researchers confirmed the signal existed and was real. The source was never definitively identified. Kokomo, Indiana, 1999. The reported symptoms were more acute: joint pain, nosebleeds, persistent nausea. The city council hired acoustic specialists. They isolated signals at 10 hertz and 36 hertz. The sources were identified: an industrial compressor and a cooling tower fan at two separate facilities. Sound attenuation measures brought the levels down. Bristol, United Kingdom. The 1970s. One of the earliest widely covered cases in the European press, initially connected to local industrial fans. A portion of the population continued reporting low-frequency perception, even after some of those sources were addressed, suggesting that in some cases the picture is more complex than a single culprit. And there is a direct historical precedent for Windsor itself, one that had been completely forgotten by 2011. In 1959, the Windsor Star carried reports of an almost identical phenomenon and described then as the Windsor Whir. The local commissioner at the time attributed it to the massive fans on Zug Island vibrating against the smokestacks, acting, in his words, like giant tuning forks. Same island, same mechanism. Half a century earlier. That history had been entirely forgotten until the same phenomenon returned in 2011. And now comes the question this story has been quietly building toward. If ordinary industrial blast furnaces can generate low-frequency signals powerful enough to affect people kilometers away, disrupting sleep, producing measurable physical symptoms, how many other invisible phenomena are affecting people right now without their knowledge? Modern industrial infrastructure constantly emits low-frequency energy, compressors, generators, cooling towers, industrial fans. These emissions are not secret. They are not classified. They are simply outside the spectrum we ordinarily think of as noise, outside what we consider worth measuring or reporting. And the Windsor case demonstrated clearly that what is invisible is not necessarily harmless. In April 2020, U.S. Steel ceased blast furnace operations on Zug Island. The shutdown was driven by economic factors, the financial pressures of the pandemic period and the changing costs of steel production. Shortly after the complaints stopped, researchers confirmed that the characteristic 35 Hz signal had disappeared from their measurements. The correlation was strong and immediate, with no formal statement from U.S. Steel explicitly acknowledging the connection. With no legal resolution, without a one lawsuit, without compensation, without a complete explanation offered to the people who had lost years of sleep, the source stopped, and silence returned. Many people treat the Windsor Hum as a closed case. The source was identified, the source stopped. Story over. But I think treating it that way means missing what the story actually demonstrated. The Windsor case is not interesting because there was a mysterious noise. It is interesting because it proved rigorously at the level of government-funded science that a completely real and completely invisible physical phenomenon can degrade the quality of life of thousands of people, produce measurable physiological effects, and persist for years without any legal or political mechanism proving capable of stopping it. Zug Island explains the source, but it doesn't explain why it took years. It doesn't explain why people reporting real, documentable physical suffering were initially dismissed as anxious or paranoid. It doesn't explain why a perfectly identifiable source could remain effectively untouchable across an international border. And it doesn't explain how many Windsor Hums exist right now in cities without researchers installing microphones, without local press to amplify the story, without enough reports to force an official investigation. A sound doesn't need to be heard to alter human behavior. It doesn't need to be loud to become impossible to ignore. It doesn't need to be paranormal to be worth taking seriously. Sometimes the most quietly disturbing phenomena are the completely real ones. The ones that have an explanation, the ones that need nothing supernatural to demonstrate that the world we inhabit is full of forces we cannot see, cannot hear, and most of the time, do not think to look for.